Hi, I'm Mira, and this is my overview of the 6 historical perspectives on the Spanish Civil War. First is vocabulary. So, one of the two fighting groups was the Leftist Popular Front, and it was a coalition of all the left-wing factions, of which there were many, some including the POUM and the Majares Libres, both of which I'll talk about later. So this was an alliance of anarchists, liberals, and communists, and it was bitterly opposed by the conservatives who feared the Soviet-influenced communism. They provoked conservative generals into launching their coup, and paved the way for the war to start because of the opposition between the Popular Front and the National Front. So this is more of a left-leaning ideology, and this is more right-leaning ideologies. So the National Front was a coalition of all the rightist forces, those who supported that 1936 military coup I mentioned, and it was composed of the Carlist monarchists and Falange. It received extensive foreign aid, particularly from Germany, but also from Italy, Portugal, and even the US, since they were so anti-communist. The Second Republic is the next vocabulary term. It lasted from 1931 to 1939, and it was formed as a result of the abdication of King Alfonso the 13th in 1931, and it lasted until the 1939 nationalist victory. This republic was noted for radicalism and instability, and their support of the corrupt Catholic Church. And so its instability was a contributing factor to the war because of the tensions it caused. Next up is the International Brigades. So the International Brigades were military units made of anti-fascist volunteers from various countries, and a lot of people who were in the International Brigades were from countries who didn't take any official action in the war, and such as Britain and France, who had the non-interventionist pact, so they agreed not to be involved in the Spanish Civil War. And so yeah, they helped defend the Second Republic. Next up is the Red Terror, and so this is a contrast to the White Terror. And so the Red Terror was by the Leftist Popular Front, and it was terrorist actions by the Leftist Popular Front against various targets, but mostly including clergymen and affiliates with the Catholic Church, which they were against. And it resulted in about 38,000 to 55,000 deaths, and again with clergy as the primary target. Next is the White Terror, which it happened during the Spanish Civil War and after, and it was fueled by Franco. It was politically motivated violence, except now instead of against members of the clergy, it was against mostly civilians, and it resulted in even more deaths. 50,000 to 200,000 is the estimate. And so nationalists during the war, such as Francisco Franco, executed this. And Franco was a general who joined the military revolt in 1936, and he emerged as the leader, or El Caudillo, which is sort of comparable to the term of Hitler as the Führer. And so after the victory in 1939, he introduced elements of fascism and martial law that were over Spain during his rule. So, cause and effect. Some long-term causes of the war are agricultural struggles. So, private estates were worked by laborers in the South, and there was a huge imbalance. And in the North, farms that were attempted to be harvested weren't economically viable. So, a lot of people were on the edge of starvation. So there were some tensions there, and people were calling for change. Next is regionalism. There was a lot of divisive political ideologies within Spain. That's why there were so many different groups and parties within the Popular Front and National Front. I think there were like over 15 just in the Popular Front alone, which is very many. Next, tensions about the Catholic Church. So the wealth and power of the Catholic Church was resented by a lot of people, and it identified with like a very high social class, and they were enemies of change, very traditionalist. So many agreed that the power had to be reduced, which is why, again, some of the Red Terror attacks occurred. Also, the army was over-officered. There was about one general for every poorly equipped soldier, and very conservative and prone to political bias. Next, and finally, one of the biggest ones that sort of encapsulates all of these is the tensions between the left and right. So, like the leftists opposed the policies at the time, and the rightists had like small revolts against them, and so there was a lot of confusion and back and forth power exchange between them. And then short-term causes is the military coup that I already discussed, and also the the death of Jose Calvo Sotelo, a member of the CEDA, and it was sort of an excuse of military officers to start the coup. And then post-war effects were that socialism and communism had like increasing relevance at the time, and because of Franco's like extreme opposition to communists, and the Germans used Spain to test some of their blitzkrieg tactics and weapons that they were starting, and so that would go on to be used in the following World War II. So for change and continuity, some of the changes that occurred within Spain were that obviously in government leadership, since the nationalists and sort of the like motivations of the coup were what rose to power. So Franco came to power and was the leader. There was that huge ideology shift and became a very fascist militarist regime. And Spain also experienced a lot of internal losses. One of these aspects was economic losses after the Civil War, because civil wars caused so much destruction internally. 10 to 15% of the national wealth decreased. There was high inflation. There were a lot of debts that the government owed, and there was no mercy by Britain or Germany in the repayment of those debts. So, yeah. And then there was also a big cost in life and standard of living. There was a lot of material destruction, infrastructure destroyed, and there were about 100,000 deaths of the Republicans and 70,000 nationalist deaths, but that doesn't include how many civilian deaths there were, and yeah, it was a lot. So some continuity that happened after the war is that the US and international opposition to communism continued. Okay, and Italy and Germany, who had worked together on the same side of the Spanish Civil War in support, they also continued to work together in World War II, obviously with, and also, as I mentioned before, the ideologies of socialism and communism continued with global tension, and the non-intervention of France and Britain that kind of put them together also continued to be an alliance in World War II. Okay, so some turning points. In February 1936, the Popular Front won the election. Parliament became primarily leftist, and so this resulted in, throughout the 30s, a lot of escalating tensions, as I mentioned before, between the left and right, which helped motivate the coup. In March 1936, more increasing tensions where the government banned the Spanish Fascist Party of the Falange. And in November 1936, there was the Battle of Guernica, which was an attack of civilians by Germany rather than the military aggression, and so that was another turning point with the number of civilian deaths there. And in March 1939, big turning point, the end of the war, where Madrid fell and was taken by nationalist forces. And so the outcome of the war was also a global turning point with its influence on World War II.
Okay, time out.
Yeah.
Take a picture. I'm sorry, I gotta wipe